May 8, 1945, the war in Europe has ended. In a makeshift prisoner of war camp near the Belgian town of Namur, the spring air carries the scent of wet earth and blooming lilac. But inside the barbed wire perimeter, there is only the smell of unwashed wool, fear, and something else: the acrid tang of disbelief. 300 women stand in formation, their grey uniforms still bearing the insignia of the Third Reich. They are Nachrichtenhelferinnen, communications auxiliaries, Stabshelferinnen, staff assistants, and nurses who serve the Wehrmacht and SS. Their faces are drawn, pale, hollowed by weeks of retreat and days of captivity. They do not yet know that in less than an hour they will be ordered to strip away the only identity many of them have ever known, and feed it to the flames. The order comes from a British captain whose voice is steady but whose eyes reveal a kind of weary determination. The uniforms must be burned, all of them. Every tunic, every skirt, every armband, every piece of clothing that bears the eagle and swastika. The women will be issued civilian clothes, plain dresses, simple blouses, items collected from relief organizations and liberated towns. They will cease to be soldiers of the Reich. They will become, once again, merely women. The captain does not raise his voice. He does not need to. The words land like stones into still water, and the ripples of shock move through the assembled ranks. Some women stand rigid, jaws clenched. Others begin to weep silently, tears tracing clean lines down dirty cheeks. A few look around as if searching for an escape that does not exist, or perhaps for an officer who might countermand the order. But there are no German officers here. Not anymore. This moment, this seemingly bureaucratic act of confiscating and destroying uniforms, will become one of the most psychologically devastating experiences of captivity for thousands of German women who served the Nazi regime. It is not the hunger, not the exhaustion, not even the shame of defeat that breaks something inside them. It is this, the forced removal of the fabric that had given them purpose, status, belonging. For many, the uniform was not merely clothing. It was proof that they mattered. It was the difference between being invisible and being essential. And now it must burn. To understand why this act struck so deeply, one must first understand what the uniform meant to the women who wore it, and how the Third Reich wove its ideology not only into the minds of German men, but into the hearts of German women as well. In the years before the war, the Nazi regime cultivated a very specific vision of German womanhood. Women were to be mothers, caretakers, the guardians of the home, and the purity of the race. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, this was the trinity that defined a woman's worth. The Reich needed sons for the army and daughters for the future, and the propaganda machine glorified motherhood with medals, financial incentives, and relentless public praise. The Mutterkreuz, the Mother's Cross, was awarded in bronze, silver, and gold to women who bore 4, 6, or 8 children respectively. To be a mother was to serve the Volk. It was duty. It was destiny. But as the war expanded and the demands of total war consumed every resource, ideology bent to necessity. By 1941, the Wehrmacht and the SS faced a growing manpower crisis. Millions of men were required at the front, and the bureaucratic machinery of the Reich, its communications networks, logistical operations, administrative offices, could not function without human labor. Women who had been told their place was in the home were now called to serve in new ways. They were recruited as auxiliaries, not as soldiers in name, but as uniformed personnel nonetheless. They operated switchboards, typed orders, decoded messages, staffed headquarters, assisted in field hospitals. They wore grey-green tunics and skirts, polished boots, insignia of rank. They saluted, they marched, they swore oaths of loyalty. For many young German women, this was not a burden. It was liberation. In a society that had offered them limited roles, the auxiliary services provided structure, responsibility, a sense of participation in something grand and historic. They were no longer confined to the narrow domesticity their mothers had known. They travelled to occupied territories. They worked alongside officers. They were addressed with respect, given tasks of importance, included in the vast machinery of the Reich's war effort. The uniform became the visible symbol of this transformation. When they put it on, they were no longer Fräulein Schmidt or Fräulein Müller, anonymous daughters of anonymous families. They were members of the Reich. They belonged. The recruitment posters promised adventure, purpose, and the chance to contribute to Germany's victory. Thousands of young women answered the call. Some were motivated by patriotism, some by economic necessity, some by the desire to escape the tedium of village life or the control of conservative parents. Some genuinely believed in the ideals of National Socialism, the racial superiority they had been taught in school, the notion that they were part of a historic mission to reshape Europe. Others believed less in ideology than in survival, in the practical reality that service meant food, shelter, and a role in a society that had been utterly militarized. Motivation varied, but the outcome was the same. By 1943, over 500,000 German women were serving in auxiliary capacities, and the uniform they wore had become inseparable from their identity. They did not carry rifles. They were not combatants in the eyes of the Reich's own laws, but they were integral to the war machine. They relayed the orders that sent divisions to the front. They processed the documents that tracked supplies, casualties, deportations. In the vast and terrible bureaucracy of the Holocaust, many women served in administrative roles, typing lists, filing papers, managing the cold logistics of genocide without ever seeing the camps themselves. Responsibility, in the Third Reich, was diffuse and compartmentalized. The women in uniform told themselves they were doing their duty. They were following orders. They were serving Germany. And then, Germany lost. The collapse came swiftly in the spring of 1945. The Red Army swept in from the east, the Western Allies from the west and south. The Reich, which had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga, contracted into a shrinking pocket of devastation. German forces disintegrated, soldiers deserted, units dissolved, the chain of command fractured. For the women in auxiliary service, the final weeks of the war were chaotic and terrifying. Some fled westward, hoping to surrender to the Americans or British rather than the Soviets. Others were abandoned by their units, left to fend for themselves on roads clogged with refugees. Some were captured in the cities they had been stationed in, arrested in their offices as Allied forces moved through. The uniforms that had once signified status and purpose now marked them as enemy personnel. The Allies had been preparing for this. Plans for the handling of prisoners of war included detailed protocols for disarmament, interrogation, and re-education. German men were to be separated by rank and unit, screened for war crimes, processed through a system designed to demilitarize and eventually reintegrate them into civilian society. German women, however, posed a different challenge. They were not classified as combatants under international law, yet many had served in capacities that directly supported military operations. The decision was made. They would be treated as prisoners of war, interned, interrogated, and subjected to the same procedures as their male counterparts. And that included the confiscation and destruction of their uniforms. For the Allied command, the reasoning was straightforward. The uniforms were symbols of the Nazi regime, and the regime had to be dismantled not only politically and militarily, but symbolically as well. Every swastika, every eagle, every remnant of Nazi iconography had to be removed from public and private life. This was denazification, the systematic effort to cleanse German society of the apparatus and imagery of fascism. Burning the uniforms was practical, it prevented their reuse, but it was also deeply symbolic. It was a statement. The Reich is over. Your allegiance to it is over. You are no longer what you were. But for the women who stood in those camps, the logic of denazification collided with the psychological reality of identity. They had not merely worn the uniforms, they had lived in them. The uniforms had been their skin for years. They had sewn on buttons, repaired tears, kept them clean and pressed, even as the Reich crumbled around them. The WWII uniforms had been proof that they mattered, that they had a place in the world. And now they were being told that place was a lie, that the identity they had constructed was something shameful, something to be destroyed. The first bonfires were lit in early May, in camps across the western zones of occupation. The procedures varied slightly from camp to camp, but the essential act was the same. Women were ordered to remove their uniforms piece by piece and place them in large piles. British, American, and French soldiers supervised, ensuring compliance, watching for hidden weapons or contraband. The women were given replacement clothing, dresses that did not fit, shoes that were too large or too small, mismatched garments that transformed them overnight from a uniformed corps into a ragged assembly of displaced persons. Then the piles were doused with gasoline and set alight. Witnesses to these burnings recorded a range of reactions. Some women complied mechanically, faces blank, moving through the motions as if in a trance. They had already been defeated. This was simply one more humiliation in a cascade of humiliations. Others wept openly, clutching the fabric before letting it go, as if parting with something living. A British nurse assigned to a women's POW camp near Brussels wrote in her diary, "They cried as if we were burning their children. I did not expect this. I thought they would be relieved to be rid of the Nazi symbols. But they were not relieved. They were shattered." Some women resisted. Not violently, but with quiet defiance. They refused to hand over certain items, a cap, a belt, a pair of gloves, claiming they were personal property, not military issue. They argued, pleaded, bargained. A few tried to hide pieces of the uniform in their personal belongings, only to have them discovered during inspections and confiscated. One American officer supervising the processing of a group of Luftwaffenhelferinnen, Air Force auxiliaries, recalled a young woman who stood clutching her tunic and refused to move. She did not shout or curse. She simply stood there, silent, tears streaming, until two soldiers gently took the tunic from her hands and led her away. The act of burning was both public and intimate. It was witnessed by the entire camp, a collective ritual of erasure, yet each woman experienced it alone. There was no solidarity in that moment, no collective defiance. The ideology that had bound them together, the Reich, the Führer, the grand narrative of German destiny, had collapsed. What remained was individual loss, personal grief, the sudden and disorienting realization that the identity they had built was being incinerated before their eyes. The psychological impact of this enforced transformation cannot be overstated. For many of these women, the uniform had been the foundation of their self-concept during the most formative years of their lives. They had come of age in the uniform. They had found purpose, structure, and belonging within the auxiliary services. The uniform had told them who they were and what they were worth. Without it, they faced a void. In the weeks and months following the burnings, camp administrators and medical personnel noted a sharp increase in depression, withdrawal, and what would later be recognized as symptoms of acute psychological trauma. Women who had been competent, disciplined, and organized became passive and unresponsive. Some refused to eat. Others sat for hours staring at nothing, unable or unwilling to engage with the reality of their situation. The loss of the uniform was experienced as a kind of death, not physical, but existential. They were no longer soldiers, no longer auxiliaries, no longer members of a grand collective. They were simply women, stripped of status and role, facing an uncertain future in a defeated nation. The interrogators and re-education officers who worked with these women often misunderstood the depth of this crisis. They assumed the women were mourning the loss of Nazi ideology, that the tears were for Hitler and the Reich. But the grief was more complicated than that. For some, yes, the loss was ideological. They had believed in the cause, and the cause was dead. But for many others, the grief was for the loss of self. The uniform had been a structure that gave life meaning. It had provided routine, hierarchy, purpose. Without it, there was only the rubble of a defeated country and the shame of having been on the wrong side of history. One young woman, a former communications assistant captured in Hamburg, was interviewed by an American re-education officer in June 1945. Her testimony, preserved in military archives, is telling. She said, "I did not join because I loved Hitler. I joined because I wanted to matter. At home, I was nothing. My brothers went to war and were heroes. I stayed and helped my mother with the washing. When I put on the uniform, I became someone. People saluted me. I had a rank. I had duties. I was important. Now they have taken it away, and I am nothing again." This sentiment was echoed by many. The uniform had been an escape from the traditional confines of German womanhood, even as it served a regime that ideologically celebrated those very confines. The contradiction did not seem to trouble most of them at the time. They had lived within the contradiction, and it had given them a space to exist beyond the roles of daughter, wife, and mother. Now, forced back into civilian dress, they confronted the possibility that they would be forced back into those traditional roles as well, in a Germany that was shattered, occupied, and economically devastated. The symbolic weight of the burning was not lost on the Allied personnel who supervised it. Many understood, on some level, that they were participating in a ritual of psychological conquest. Destroying the uniforms was not merely a practical measure. It was an assertion of power, a demonstration that the old order was finished and the new order had begun. The women were not being asked to renounce their allegiance. They were being forced to witness its physical annihilation. Some Allied soldiers and officers felt uncomfortable with this. They saw the distress it caused and questioned whether it was necessary. One British officer, writing home to his wife, described the scene. "We burned their uniforms today. It had to be done, I suppose, but I felt like we were doing something cruel. They are not soldiers. They are girls, really, and they looked so lost. One of them asked me what she was supposed to do now, and I had no answer for her." Others felt no sympathy. They had seen the concentration camps. They had walked through the ruins of cities bombed by the Luftwaffe. They had liberated the survivors of Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald. For them, the distress of a few hundred German women was a minor footnote in a war that had caused unimaginable suffering. The uniforms represented a system that had murdered millions. Burning them was justice, not cruelty. This tension between understanding the individual human experience and condemning the collective guilt ran through the entire Allied occupation. The women in the camps existed in a liminal space. They were victims of their own government's collapse, but they had also been participants in that government's machinery. They had not ordered atrocities, but their labor had enabled them. Sorting through this moral complexity was the work of years, not days, and in the meantime, the uniforms burned. Among the women who experienced this, there was one object that recurred in their memories, one symbol that came to represent the chasm between what they had been and what they had become. The thread. Before the burning, many women had spent hours maintaining their uniforms. They had mended seams, sewn on buttons, embroidered initials inside collars. The thread they used was often scavenged, traded, carefully hoarded. In a wartime economy where everything was scarce, thread was valuable. It held things together. It made repairs possible. It was a tool of preservation. After the burning, thread became useless. There were no uniforms to mend. The civilian clothes they were given were ill-fitting and often damaged, but the women were not provided with sewing supplies to repair them. The skills they had developed, the ability to keep a uniform sharp and regulation, to present a disciplined appearance, were suddenly irrelevant. Thread, which had been a symbol of care and continuity, became a symbol of loss. Some women kept small spools of thread hidden in their belongings, though they had nothing to use it for. It was a memento of a time when they had control, when they had purpose, when the act of sewing a button was an act of maintaining order in a world that made sense. In the later testimonies of women who survived the war and captivity, thread appears again. And again. One woman interviewed in the 1980s recalled, "I kept a spool of grey thread for 30 years. I do not know why. I never used it, but I could not throw it away. It was the last piece of that life." Another said, "When I sewed my children's clothes after the war, I would remember sewing my uniform. It was strange. I hated the uniform by then. I hated what it had meant, but I missed the feeling of it. I missed knowing what I was." This is the paradox at the heart of the experience. The women came to understand over time that the Reich had been evil, that they had served a criminal regime, that the war had been unjust. But they could not undo the fact that for a time the service had given them something real. The uniform had been wrong, but it had also been theirs. And when it burned, part of them burned with it. The re-education programs that followed the burnings were designed to dismantle the ideological structures of Nazism and replace them with democratic values. The women were shown films of the concentration camps. They were lectured on the crimes of the regime. They were told that they had been deceived, that Hitler had betrayed Germany, that the war had been a catastrophe of Germany's own making. Some accepted this. Others resisted, clinging to the belief that they had been fighting for their country, that the atrocities were exaggerations or the work of a few criminals, not the system itself. But whether they accepted or resisted, the burning of the uniforms had already done its work. It had severed them from the structure that had defined them. They could not go back. The Reich was gone, and with it, the roles they had played within it. They were forced to rebuild their identities from scratch in a Germany that was itself being rebuilt from rubble. For some, this rebuilding was a kind of liberation. Freed from the rigid hierarchies and ideological demands of the Nazi state, they found new ways to live. They pursued educations that had been interrupted by the war. They built careers in the new West Germany in fields that had been closed to women before. They married, raised families, and tried to forget the years they had spent in uniform. The uniform became a source of shame, something not spoken of, a chapter in their lives they wished to erase. For others, the rebuilding was incomplete. They remained haunted by the loss, not of the Reich, but of the sense of purpose and belonging it had provided. They drifted through the post-war years, unable to fully integrate into a society that had no use for their wartime skills and no patience for their wartime service. They were neither victims nor perpetrators in the clean categories that post-war Germany tried to construct, and so they existed in the margins, forgotten by history. The burning of the uniforms was not unique to women. Male prisoners of war also had their uniforms confiscated and destroyed. But for men, the military identity was more readily accepted, as legitimate, even in defeat. A soldier who had fought was still a soldier. His uniform represented service, however misguided the cause. For women, the legitimacy of their service was never fully recognized. They had been auxiliaries, not combatants. They had served in a capacity that the Nazi regime itself had considered secondary, a concession to necessity rather than a validation of women's military role. And yet, the women had worn the uniform with the same pride and sense of duty as the men. The contradiction was never resolved. In the post-war years, the women who had served were largely erased from the narrative of the war. The memory of the Wehrmacht was dominated by images of male soldiers. The women became invisible again, just as they had been before they put on the uniform. The burning, in this sense, was complete. It destroyed not only the physical fabric, but the historical memory of their service. Decades later, historians began to recover these stories. Archives were opened, testimonies were recorded. The women who had served the Reich and who had stood in those camps in the spring of 1945, watching their uniforms burn, finally spoke. Their accounts revealed the complexity of their experience, the mixture of pride and shame, the sense of loss and relief, the difficulty of reconciling who they had been with who they had become. One recurring theme in these testimonies is the moment of the burning itself. It remains for many the defining memory of the war's end. Not the surrender, not the occupation, but that moment when they were ordered to destroy the only identity they had known. It was the moment when the abstract reality of defeat became personal and undeniable. The Reich could fall, cities could be occupied, leaders could be captured, but as long as they wore the uniform, they could still imagine themselves as part of something. The burning took that away. In the end, the burning of the uniforms was an act of both destruction and creation. It destroyed an identity, but it also cleared the ground for new identities to emerge. The women who stood by those fires in the spring of 1945 were forced to confront a question that defined the post-war generation. Who are you when everything you believed in is gone? Who are you when the structure that gave your life meaning is revealed to be a lie? Some found answers. Others spent the rest of their lives searching, but all of them carried the memory of that fire, the smell of burning wool, the sight of grey fabric turning to black ash, the feeling of standing in a dress that did not fit, in a world that no longer made sense. The thread could not hold. The seams had come apart. And in the ashes of the uniform, something new, uncertain, and painfully human had to be built.